So it's 2020 here in the US. Well, it's 2020 everywhere. Okay, cool. So it's 2020, and that's an election year here in the US, which I'm sure will be fine. There's an idea circulating in the cultural ether that news has gotten worse, that mainstream media cannot be trusted, there are political grifters around every corner, and generally the only thing you can do is lie down and wait for death. The good news is there is something we can do other than lie on the floor and wait for death. The bad news is it's kind of boring. Hi, I'm Magdalen Rose. In this video, we're going to take a look at yellow journalism, which despite the term sounding racist, isn't actually, how to combat it, and some philosophy, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
I should like to have it set up my second
with the DC swamp, where a very angry and very confused, bewildered Nancy Pelosi continues inexplicably to cling on to her BS articles of impeachment.
Yellow journalism has been around in one form or another probably since the proliferation of the printing press, but it really solidified into a thing in the 1890s during this intense feud between newspaper giants William Randolph Hearst and John Pulitzer. So this feud was essentially a millionaire dick measuring contest, but the yellow comes from The Yellow Kid, a character created by Richard F. Outcole. Sorry. He was originally hired to make comics for Pulitzer's New York World, then later headhunted by Hearst for the New York Journal. 1800s newspaper tycoons were a petty breed. Yellow journalism is characterized by being high on sensationalism, low on context, and absolutely drowning in hyperbole. It's a little joke because this is a very hyperbolic statement. Now, we have an equivalent term in the modern day in fake news. However, fake news tends to get thrown around for any information that contradicts one's worldview, and thus the term has been rendered pretty much useless. Yellow journalism could technically be commenting on something real, but the level of exaggeration and bias taints the information to the point where it can no longer be considered real journalism. So journalism hasn't really gotten worse. The same problems of bias and trickery have always been there. So why does it feel like we've descended into this cavernous hole of sleazy, gaslighting garbage? Well, I have a theory. There has always been bad journalism, but there hasn't always been this many options. We're just absolutely spoiled for choice for which bullshit artists we want to tell us how to think. Gosh, who should I let propagandize to me today? Huffington Post? Tim Pool? Or maybe Big Meat Boy Jordan Peterson? How about I read some articles at Patriot, Freedom, Truth, fucking 9/11 was an inside job, news.net. Not only is there a lot more news, the news we get is much more fractured. So the news given to people who lean politically left is almost completely divorced from the news given to those on the right. Americans are living in the same country while also existing within multiple fractured realities. And that makes it pretty hard to come to a consensus on anything. Not to mention that a lot of what's being written is, how do I put this delicately? Bullshit. No, wait. I question its journalistic integrity. Let's look at a recent example from CNBC. America just took out the world's #1 bad guy. This headline is referring to the US launching a rocket at a convoy at the Baghdad airport that killed General Qasem Soleimani. So there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, by America, he means the US military. Just took out seems rather flippant for a strike that could have serious consequences, including launching us into a war with Iran, so points deducted for tact. The world's #1 bad guy. The world's? Like the whole world? Where'd you do that poll, man? God. And finally, to use the term bad guy is just embarrassingly poor journalism. And that's not to say Soleimani wasn't bad. I mean, Ambassador Wendy Sherman did come out and say it's probably a good thing he's dead, But it's not the job of a journalist to paint a picture for us of who is good and who is bad, because in almost every situation, it's more complicated than just goodies and baddies. In order for something to be journalism, it has to strive to have as little bias as possible from the author. If it doesn't, then it's just opinion. Honestly, some of these independent journalists on Twitter should just scrap their blogs and get a goddamn diary. But yellow journalism isn't just frustrating, it can also be dangerous. For instance, in the first few hours after a mass shooting, it's become common to see people making accusations about the shooter before anything is known. Within an hour of the shooting at a Texas church in 2019, there were commenters in right-leaning pro-gun groups saying the shooter was affiliated with Antifa. But as of the making of this video, there's absolutely no evidence to that whatsoever. It's just some guy's diary entry for that day. False accusations aimed at blaming a political opponent can lead to confusion, discord, and even violence. Now hang on a minute, Maggie, we're all adults here, mostly, according to my analytics. Shouldn't we just use our heads? This was actually the exact argument put to me years ago when I was foolishly trying to explain to a bunch of internet reviewers on the internet that the media they consume affects them. Listen, I know, it was a different time. I was very naive. Shouldn't we, as evolved beings, use our impeccable galaxy brains to decipher news from opinion, fact from fiction? Because aren't we first and foremost beings of reason? No. At least not according to 18th century philosopher David Hume. That's right, folks. It's philosophy time. Again, I am sorry. Now, before we continue, I want to point out that Hume was a racist, and not in the usual embarrassing grandpa sort of way, like he wrote a footnote in his essay Of National Characters about how non-whites were inferior to the white race. Galaxy brain indeed. But I don't think that discounts his ideas about skepticism. A broken clock is right twice a day, I guess. Hume thought that human reason is a slave to human passions. That is, our ability to reason is controlled by our emotions and desires. And anyone who's been on the internet for a while can see that, well, it checks out. People often see what they want to see and twist reason to fit what feels right. That means we're easily misled by people who are ideologically similar to us, and we have a harder time believing those who would contradict our worldview, even if the evidence is in their favor. Many readers probably missed entirely that this headline from CNBC is in the opinion section, because it's off in the corner and the eye is naturally drawn to larger text. This is a headline from a major news outlet that was taken seriously by probably thousands of readers that he might as well have scrawled on a bathroom stall in a public restroom. So, this sucks. We're drowning in news that's badly written at best and at worst, intentionally misleading. Now, one reaction I often see will sound familiar. It's, oh well, all mainstream media is fake news. I guess you can't trust any of it. I guess everything is bullshit. Yada, 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 bleep, blorp, blop. You usually hear this one from guys in their 20s and 30s who just want an excuse to not, pay attention to the news. But this reaction is lazy. There are good sources out there. You just need to use your handy-dandy tool, media literacy. How do we use media literacy to help find credible sources? God, this is the lamest, most English teachery title I've ever written. Media literacy tip number 1. Don't get your news from social media. I'll repeat that. Don't get your news from social media. Social media news is over. It's done. It's canceled. The problem with getting your news from social media is that once you've interacted with an article by clicking, sharing, or commenting, the algorithm will begin to show you more and more of the same material. So if you click on too many articles about, animal cruelty or something, you're going to be continually shown more and more news about animal rights, which leads people to believe the issue is at the forefront of the national conversation. This is how people get trapped in echo chambers where all they ever talk about is one issue. But let's say your relatives haven't gotten the memo yet that we no longer get our news from social media, and they mistakenly post an emotionally driven news article from immigrantsAreBad.com. Without clicking the link, look at the source here. Tab over and go to MediaBiasFactCheck.com. Type in that news outlet and see what comes up. If the news source is biased, link the page in the comment section. If you suspect it's too much effort to actually click the link, just take a screenshot and post that instead. It may seem passive-aggressive, but it's the only way they'll learn. You can also use sites like factcheck.org and Snopes for fact-checking articles. Tip number 2, find good sources and stick to them. On Media Bias Fact Check, you can filter sources by least biased. A lot of these will be local newspapers and surprisingly a large amount from the military, but as far as national and international news, Reuters and Politico are both ranked very high for factual reporting. I also recommend following individual journalists instead of entire outlets. For instance, MSNBC can be pretty biased toward the left, I'll admit. I personally don't like the reporting by Lawrence O'Donnell because he just spends most of his show ranting, which isn't news, Lawrence. On the other hand, I found that Rachel Maddow's reporting is pretty solid. She's really good at explaining the history and background of events so they can be put into their proper context. Maddow has a degree in public policy, and she's a Rhodes Scholar. She's also technically a doctor of philosophy for all you beings of pure reason out there. But even good journalists slip up, so stay vigilant and call them out on things when they stray. Tip number 3, says who? This one may lose you some friends, I'm not going to lie. Say your coworker says, "Did you hear about insert some outlandish hogwash here?" Get into the habit of immediately responding with, "Well, where'd you hear that?" In order to answer, the person has to check their source or admit that they don't actually know. Honestly, I think most people like indulging in yellow journalism as a way to bond with like-minded people. Like, they don't actually really care if it's true or exaggerated, so questioning it is gonna be kind of annoying, but it's a really icky practice that causes misinformation to spread through a community like a virus. Intellectually speaking, your coworker might as well have sneezed in your face. Tip number 4, grow up. I know this sounds harsh, but hear me out. The problem with unbiased news is that it's boring and it's harder. Biased sources that have an agenda will always have an edge because they do all the thinking for you. They not only tell you what happened, kind of sometimes, they also tell you how you're supposed to feel about it. They tell you a version of the story you already want to hear. But this is child's play. It's the Tinker Toys of news journalism. It is time to put away the micro machines, kids, and do some goddamn homework. Dress it up if you have to. Go to a coffee shop in a beret. Get a digital note-taking app and planner-addict the shit out of it. And then put your notes on Instagram. Hashtag Newsies. I will send an Amazon gift card to the first person who comes up with a better hashtag. Following these tips will not guarantee that you will never get tricked by yellow journalism again, but it will greatly improve your ability to detect bad faith arguments and manipulation. So run free, my cyber sleuths. Let the art of deduction be your sword and shield. Go and be a thorn in the side of all hack journalists and propagandists wherever they may be. This video is supported on Patreon by viewers like you. Thank you.